Hi, and welcome back, everyone. Our next session, Natural and Artificial Social Learning, will be moderated by Sheila Mcelray. Sheila is a professor in the Department of Computer Science at the University of Toronto. She's also a CFAR AI chair, a faculty member at the Vector Institute, and like Peter and Lisa, she's an associate director here at the Schwartz Reisman Institute. Sheila's work focuses on AI sequential decision-making, broadly construed through the lens of human-compatible AI. She's author of over 100 scholarly publications in the area of knowledge, representation, automated reasoning, and machine learning, and her research has made practical contributions to the development of next-generation NASA space systems and emerging web standards. Sheila, over to you.
Thanks, Monique. So welcome everybody to the session on natural and artificial social learning. As Monique mentioned, my name is Sheila Mcelray, and I'll be moderating our conversation today. Social learning suggests that agents can learn behavior by observing and imitating others. We see various forms of social learning across the animal kingdom, but social learning is particularly prevalent and also remarkable in humans, where we attribute it as contributing to our ability to empathize and to work together. Our session today pairs two scholars, one from philosophy and one from computer science, to delve more deeply into this fascinating topic. The session will provide a better sense of our understanding of social learning, how social learning can help us build better AI, and what insights we can gain from those AI systems about one of the most remarkable features of natural intelligence. To that end, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Jennifer Nagel, who is a professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Toronto, a faculty affiliate at the Schwartz Reisman Institute for Technology and Society, and currently serving as the president of the Canadian Philosophical Association. Jennifer's research specializes in epistemology and philosophy of mind, with her most recent work focusing on intuitive impressions of knowledge and belief, on the guidance of these impressions that these impressions provide in the ordinary course of conversations and social interactions, and also on what these impressions can tell us about knowledge itself. So welcome to Jennifer, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Sheila. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Can you see that okay?
Yeah.
Great. All right. So my topic today is social learning. Incredibly powerful, incredibly mysterious. And my sense is that artificial intelligence is putting us in a position now to perhaps explore some of the mysteries of this area, but it's also creating some new mysteries of its own. My emphasis is going to be on how social learning manifests itself in nature, but we'll see that some of the problems in this area lead very naturally into the kinds of investigations that Natasha will be telling us about. So just to start with an example of how social learning functions, you could think about a situation in which the same problem could be handled either socially or asocially by two otherwise very similar animals. So if you're a prey animal, like a mongoose or a meerkat, one of the most important things for you to know at any given time is whether or not there is a predator approaching. The yellow mongoose here on the left does this alone, figures it out alone. It forages in a solitary way, very unusual for it to be within 50 meters of a member of its kind, and has to rely on its own eyes and ears to tell when there's a predator approaching. Meerkats, on the other hand, forage in groups, typically of about a dozen, and they have a couple members of their kind keeping lookout. And you see they're looking in all different directions. And if one of the sentinels sees a predator approaching, it will issue a warning call and alert the pack so they can run off together. So as a result, although this picture doesn't illustrate it very clearly, a lot of the time, these animals, when they're foraging, they'll be learning about the approach of predators secondhand through an alarm call, not immediately through seeing the predator for themselves. Now, you might think, looking at the contrast in these ways of thinking, that somehow the meerkats would have an enormous advantage because they get to rely on the eyes and ears of others to perform this vital function. But actually, in the wild, the outcomes for these animals are very similar, and they inhabit actually the same environment. They're both out there in the Kalahari Desert, and they're foraging in very similar patterns and similar similar levels of courage in terms of getting away from ground cover. And animal ethologists have actually looked very hard to try and figure out what is the advantage of social learning about predator detection in the meerkats. And they've come up with only some very small gains, because meerkats can really forage in a very head down way, at least during the times that they're not on sentinel duty. Maybe there's one or two kinds of grubs and scorpions that they can catch that the mongooses don't. But it seems to be only a very slender advantage that's afforded to them by this power of working as a group to solve the problem of when predators approach. So this is it's kind of an interesting phenomenon that working together with others doesn't automatically confer a huge advantage, except of course when it does. So if you look at other spots on the spectrum of natural life, you see some animals working together in ways that are very, very productive in very, very distinctive ways. So it's actually been said to be, the evolutionarily distinct feature of our species, that we can think together, solve problems together, cooperate with each other, communicate with each other. So this is something very much championed by Michael Tomasello in particular, who thinks that the most remarkable achievements of human beings are actually made possible by our capacity to coordinate, collaborate, think together, put our minds together. So it's a natural question what it is about social learning that gives it this interest that makes it so prevalent in the natural kingdom at all, and that gives it sort of a special, unique power for humans in particular. If you try to analyze, what social learning is, zero in on some definitions, you'll find a lot of the definitions are really very broad. So going back to work by people like Hilary Bach in the 80s, you'll see social learning defined as learning that's influenced by observation of or interaction with another agent. Originally, I think this was another animal, typically a conspecific, but there is social learning across the boundary between species. And also now that we're working in a new landscape with artificial agents, we can start to think about the possibility of social learning between animals and AI as well. One problem with this definition is that it is so broad that it's going to encompass the behavior of the yellow mongoose as well, even though he's out there on his own, just scanning the horizon intermittently for signs of a predator, because his learning that the predator is approaching is going to be influenced by the predator's behavior. That's going to come off as social learning, even though he's not relying on cues from another animal to tell whether a predator is coming. So it's been objected that this definition gets very close to applying to any type of learning at all. It's hard to show that learning isn't influenced by another animal. If you can be distracted from some learning task by another animal, that shouldn't be enough to convert whatever you're doing in that learning task into social learning. So I think a more productive way to move forward would be to think of social learners as not just influenced by other animals, but as gaining the knowledge of other animals. So whether this is declarative knowledge, knowing that a predator is approaching, or procedural knowledge, knowing how to do some very particular thing, you are engaged in social learning if somehow another animal's knowledge that P is the case, or knowledge of how to do phi, is crossing the gap over to you, crossing the gap between one agent and another. So that very thing that the other animal knows is somehow transmitted to you, and not just through some kind of common cause in your genetics, in your architecture as an agent. And the big question is how then social learning is possible. And that's a question that doesn't have an easy answer, because the kinds of behaviors that have been labeled as types of social learning are very diverse. There might not be a single thing here, a single kind of mechanism social learning might not be what philosophers call a natural kind, a sort of unified concept. Be that as it may, there's a really interesting spectrum of transmission types by means of which knowledge progresses from one animal to another. So we can start with the sort of more superficial kinds of social learning, enhancement. So if you see a flock of pigeons mobbing on a loaf of bread that's been tossed in the market square, that's that sort of flocking behavior is a manifestation of this. One animal's interest in a desirable object can trigger similar interest on the part of others. There doesn't have to be any kind of special mechanism associated with this. So gaze following behavior is often thought of this way, at least in some animals. You can learn through really ordinary forms of conditioning, that turning your gaze to align with the gaze of other animals, like these northern bald ibises in the picture, is something that can lead to interesting rewards. There's nothing uniquely social about this. So if animals are turning their heads the same way that members of their kind turn their heads, because in the past that kind of coordinated behavior has been reinforced, this is not so different from following signals from inanimate parts of reality. For example, following the motion of a shadow, seeing that as triggering, seeing that as indicative of something that's going on overhead. But when you get into sort of richer forms of social learning, it does seem like there's something more distinctive happening. So if you move up to emulation or imitation, where you have a sophisticated behavioral sequence that gets transmitted over to another animal, then it really does seem that that there's something that's more distinctive happening. Just going to underscore before we go on that all these forms of social learning are found in animals other than humans. Even say communication is found among eusocial insects. So bees can communicate with each other. Mind you, they are restricted to certain very narrow topics of conversation. So they can only communicate about nectar, source, strength, and direction. We seem to have a much more open-ended capacity for social learning, and I'll come back to that. Very basic social learning doesn't demand social living. You don't, as an agent, have to have an architecture that has set you up to live with members of your kind in order to profit from demonstrations of their knowledge. So again, to show that this really is social learning going on and not just similarity in genetically prescribed behavior, you have to demonstrate this with some kind of novel behavior that you induce in your animal. So this is some really nice experimental work by Anna Wilkinson and colleagues. They have tortoises trained through a successive approximation procedure, think of a trail of breadcrumbs, to solve this very simple maze. The maze is hard for this tortoise to solve because the dotted lines there represent something like a chain link fence that the tortoise can't go through, but the tortoise can see the desirable food item in the center there. And the tortoise has to do something very counterintuitive. It has to walk away from the food in order to attain it. And it's very hard to train tortoises to do this. They don't spontaneously solve this problem, even given it quite an enormous amount of time. But interestingly, if you take the red-footed tortoise, this is an animal that's very solitary, no parental involvement, it lays the eggs and leaves, they don't live with each other. They don't see each other really except for mating. Take this animal and you expose it to the demonstration of a trained tortoise solving this maze. It sees this behavior only once. And then its chance of actually solving this maze is elevated enormously. So most tortoises actually can do this after they see another member of their kind solving the puzzle in front of them, although they cannot do that if they're just put in there alone. But it's when the tortoise solves a problem of this type. So it's been suggested that this kind of achievement is not so dissimilar from that sort of low-level local enhancement procedure where you see some attention drawn to a trajectory. Maybe it would work the same way if we just shone a really bright laser light on that path before setting our tortoise free. So it's not immediately clear what it is that's enabling animals to do this kind of thing. If you go out into the wild and look at richer patterns of behavior, you can find some really intriguing demonstrations of social learning in the wild. So this is particularly true with whales and songbirds. They seem to be capable of transmitting really sophisticated behaviors to each other. And there's been a lot of sort of experimental work on this in recent years. Still, you might wonder whether...
Was that form again?
I'm sorry. Sorry, I'm getting some mixed signal in my audio. Okay. Still, you can wonder whether there's something really distinctive going on with human beings that enables us to progress in sort of radically different ways from what we're seeing in other animals. So, songbirds, again, they can transmit, particular sequences of notes. It seems that we're able to transmit much more, and we're somehow producing cumulative cultural evolution. And methodologically, it's really difficult to sort of peel apart the early origins of a different way of thinking. Anatomical developments leave a physical mark that we can trace. We can look at old skeletons. The emergence of new ways of thinking, however, are notoriously difficult to trace. They do have some anatomical correlates, so we can look at the progression of the brain in the primate family. And we see some remarkable correlations between the size of social groups that animals live in and the sophistication of the brain development, the relationship between the ratio between the higher functions of the brain and the cortex and the rest of the brain. There's a very, very positive relationship there. There's also a very positive relationship between the extent of social learning and teaching and that brain ratio. But the puzzle that's very hard to solve is sort of like, what is cause and what is effect there? Is it that the richer social environment of primates who are interacting with a lot of members of their kind is something that enables certain kinds of new forms of social learning and puts evolutionary pressure on brain size, or is it the other way around? Is it that for whatever reason, expanding brain size generated the possibility of living and working with more members of your kind? One of the things that's really interesting in these new AI models that we have is we can tease apart the contribution made by having a richer social environment with more agents in it and having richer cognitive capacity. Those are two things that you can, or a different architecture within the agent. Those are two things that you can pull apart that really seem to be hopelessly entangled with each other if we're just looking at patterns in animals. Another thing you can do, though, when you're looking at nature is you can look at more specific mechanisms for selective social learning. So just randomly copying the behavior of other agents doesn't look to be automatically advantageous. If what social learning really is some kind of vicarious use of the knowledge of another agent, it would seem the better you can represent that knowledge or have some proxy for that knowledge, the better social learning will work. And there's various proxies and representations that have been suggested. So it could be that animals who are socially learning in a successful way are the ones who are somehow attuned or adjusted to copy successful members of their kind, or prestigious members, or maybe the majority, or there may be special conditions under which we copy other animals. So maybe we just copy when uncertain, or we copy when we're dissatisfied with what we're getting. There are all sorts of different proposals, and different animal species seems to have different ways of solving this. So rats, for example, seem not to be very attuned to copying particular individuals. What drives them towards social learning seems to be more a matter of circumstance. Other animals do it somewhat differently. We've still got a lot of difficulties with confounds here, though, because the success of another animal is something that can attract attention. So again, if you have a tendency to copy animals that are successful, maybe it's really that you're just copying animals that you're attending to more closely. So you don't have that prior representation of what the animal knows that's guiding your behavior, unless you're human. Now, it seems that humans in particular have very, very finely tuned selective social learning. So this is something that's been demonstrated in a lot of work in developmental psychology. Children, for example, are very good at picking up new vocabulary items from individuals that they're interacting with. And they seem very sensitive to whether that individual is or is not knowledgeable. So some classic work by Melissa Koenig and colleagues manipulated whether the person that the child was interacting with was getting things right or getting things wrong. So a demonstrator who would repeatedly label things incorrectly and say banana was then not followed in a novel word learning task, whereas an equally friendly experimenter who was getting it right, bottle, was taken to be an adequate demonstrator. So this is interesting because it's not something shallow like immediate success that attracts attention. It's a lasting representation that the learner is projecting onto the agent that the learner is following to guide their social learning. So it does seem like maybe there's something special about how humans represent knowledge, and this could be the key, or one of the keys, to how we're able to deploy social learning so flexibly and so deliberately and strategically. So a lot of animals seem to sort of engage in something more like inadvertent social learning. Maybe they're genetically prescribed to signal each other in certain ways. We seem to do things strategically and deliberately. And in a flexible way. So one of the things that human infants do that chimpanzees never do is communicate by pointing. And you can point at anything. And it looks like one of the things that happens when parents and caregivers point things out to each other is that they're trying to generate this state of shared knowledge between themselves. I want to, at this point, so we're almost out of time, but I want to just highlight something that actually connects us back with the meerkats again, because meerkats have been identified as a species that teaches. So adult meerkats will provision their pups with disabled scorpions to play with it looks like some kind of pedagogical technique. But it doesn't seem like the meerkats are provisioning their young with knowledge in the way that we do. This is a very sort of narrowly prescribed behavior that applies really only to one class of objects. And it's something that can be triggered in meerkats just by hearing recordings of pups of different ages. It's extremely inflexible. We seem to have something much richer if we've got this sort of concept of knowledge that we want to share that could be about anything anything at all. It really is sort of topic neutral. Now, one of the things that I find really exciting about the kind of work that people like Natasha are doing is that it promises to sort of separate some of the confounds that affect us when we look at social learning in nature or even in ourselves, because we're so steeped in our own social learning and in natural language in particular. It's really hard for us to figure out what the ultimate distinctive mechanisms are that are driving us. It's, either logistically impossible or unethical to experiment with social deprivation for creatures like us. But in multi-agent reinforcement learning of the type that Natasha's doing, we can try to pull these things apart. And in particular, we can look at the relationship between giving a creature an environment of a certain level of complexity and the emergence of behaviors like cooperation and like communication. So it seems to be a brand new way to tease apart the underlying mechanisms that contribute to this very complex, very powerful phenomenon of transmitting knowledge from one agent to another. And with that, I'm going to switch it over to Sheila again.
Thanks, Jennifer. That was extremely interesting and enlightening, and a perfect segue into our next speaker. So research in AI presents the opportunity to build computational models inspired by social learning, seemingly replicating some aspects of natural social learning, while others really remain elusive. Here to tell us about this is Natasha Jakes. Natasha is a senior research scientist at Google Brain, where her research focuses on social reinforcement learning, RL, in multi-agent and human AI interactions. Natasha completed her PhD at MIT, interning at DeepMind and Google Brain, and she subsequently completed a postdoc at UC Berkeley. Natasha has received a number of accolades for her work. Her doctoral dissertation was honored with an outstanding PhD dissertation award from the Association for the Advancement of Effective Computing, and her research has been cited frequently in the popular press. She's a rising star in her field. So welcome, Natasha, who's going to tell us about social reinforcement learning.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. And thanks, Jennifer, for the really exciting introduction. Basically, I want to ask this question of, how can social learning benefit AI? How can we accelerate AI through social learning? And I tend to focus on this in two contexts. So in the context of multi-agent interactions, where, as Jennifer said, you can set up a multi-agent system and study questions of social motivation and how it can affect learning in that kind of system. And then I think about social learning from human AI interactions. So how do you actually learn from humans? For the purposes of today's talk, I'll focus on the multi-agent side, and I'll talk about two pieces of work on coordination and on studying social learning specifically. Before I get into that, I'll give a brief introduction to reinforcement learning in AI. So essentially, this is an AI paradigm where we think of having an agent that's interacting with an environment over time. And so at each time step, the agent observes the state of the world and takes an action, and it gets back a reward. And the agent's goal is to maximize its total expected discounted future reward over the course of the whole episode. So we can think of it like this equation where we're summing up all the rewards that occur across time. We're discounting things that happen too far in the future because that's a little more uncertain. So what makes RL distinct from other forms of machine learning is really that it's doing this sequential decision making. Instead of making a single decision, like a classifier decides if there's a cat in an image, reinforcement learning is making a series of decisions to really optimize this reward over time. And so this is why it's appropriate for contexts like social learning, where you're interacting with other agents in the environment over time, because there are many things going on and you're not just making one decision. I'll mention some equations that might come up. A key thing we like to want to estimate is the value of a state. So basically, this tells us after we've interacted with the environment many, many times, we build up an expected estimate of the total reward we can get when we're in a particular state, or when we take a particular action in a particular state. And if we can learn these, then we kind of know how we should be acting in the environment, because we can just say, hey, this action looks like it's going to have the highest payoff, so why don't we take that action? All right, so I often use deep reinforcement learning. That just means we're going to use deep neural networks to estimate this policy for the agent. So let's dive into this problem of learning coordination. So in this work, we wanted to train agents to learn to coordinate with each other socially, but have them train independently in a fully decentralized way. We had this intuition that if we reward agents for increasing the mutual information between their actions, that's going to help them learn to discover coordinated behaviors. So basically, in the case where you are successfully coordinating with another agent, we can see that there should be high mutual information between your actions. So imagine, that you and I are coordinating to lift a heavy piece of furniture. If you lift the furniture more quickly, then I would have to respond by doing that as well. So there's this influence or dependency between our actions in the case where we're successfully coordinating. So what we decided to do in this work is say, why don't we give agents an intrinsic social motivation or an extra incentive to have a causal influence on the actions of another agent? So I'm really interested in this idea of these incentives we could give agents that help spur social learning, So this is one idea for an incentive you could give agents to help them learn to coordinate. So let's see how we actually do this. We're going to start with our standard deep reinforcement learning agent. It's perceiving the state of the world and it's outputting its policy and value function, as we learned about. And we're going to add some extra layers. And these layers are going to act as a model of the other agents in the environment. So we're going to use these to predict the action of every other agent at the next time step, conditioned on every agent's action at the current time step. And we're just going to train this by observing the actions we see other agents taking. And we're going to train it with supervised learning. What this model allows us to do is to basically simulate counterfactual actions. So if I'm agent A, I can ask myself, what do I predict this other agent, agent B, would do if I had taken this action instead? So I can plug that counterfactual into my model and see what would happen. And if I do that a bunch, I can sample a bunch of counterfactual actions, plug them into my model of agent B, and sum over all of those counterfactuals. I can basically get this marginalized policy of the other agent. So my prediction of what the other agent does by default, if it's ignoring me. And then the divergence between that other agent's marginal policy and that other agent's policy conditioned on my action is actually a measure of the causal influence of my action on the other agent. And we can establish causality using causal diagrams following Pearl's work, which we can show in the paper. But the key punchline here is that we're going to give this as a reward to agent A. So agent A is going to get a reward if it takes an action that causes agent B to do something differently. Now, I said I wanted to use this to incentivize coordination, but there's kind of a problem with this. So you might be noticing it already, but I'll give you one slide to think it over, and then I'm going to ask if anyone can figure out what could possibly go wrong here with this reward. So before I ask you that, I do want to point out that this does have a connection to the mutual information, as we show in the paper. And what we show is that basically in expectation over many different random trajectories that we train with RL, maximizing this influence reward will end up maximizing the mutual information between agents' actions. So you can think of this as an intrinsic motivation to increase the dependency between your actions. But will this always lead to cooperation? What do you guys think? Does anyone have an answer? What could go wrong here? I don't know if we can take audience questions, but I'm hoping we can.
Feel free to type something in the chat or raise your hands if you have an opinion. Natasha, you have no takers.
Oh, no. Okay. Well, I think maybe if one of you two want to go for it, otherwise I can just give the spoiler. But all right, I'll give the punchline away. So basically, we've asked one agent to maximize its influence on the actions of another agent, because we said if we're coordinating, there would be high influence between the agents. But the issue is that while that's true, it's not the case that having high influence or having high mutual information will always lead to cooperation or coordination. You could actually have high mutual information in the case that you're competing with the other agent. So just maximizing influence isn't going to get you to cooperation. I mean, if I just stand in your way, I've influenced you to walk around me, but I haven't helped you. So it's not always the case that this will lead to beneficial actions for the other agent. So we end up taking two different approaches to correct for this in this work, or to compensate for this. So the first is to test in these environments where cooperation is exactly the hard problem. So the first environment is a tragedy of the commons environment. These agents are trying to pick up these green apples. And if they harvest these apples too quickly, they become depleted. And if they harvest all the apples, none will grow back and all the agents will go hungry. So you can see that while each agent is greedily motivated to eat more apples, if they all follow that strategy, it's bad for everyone. Similarly, cleanup, the agents have to clean this river in order to make apples appear, but it's a partially observed environment. So while they're cleaning the river, they can't observe if any apples are appearing as a result of their efforts. So other agents can easily exploit them while they're doing sort of all the hard work. So to make this concrete, we can establish quantitatively that these are social dilemmas using these shelling diagrams. So what you're seeing here is the payoff that an individual agent can expect to get if it follows a defecting strategy in red or a cooperating strategy in blue, depending on the number of agents that are cooperating with it. So what you can see is that on almost all the time, an individual agent is greedily motivated to defect because it can get higher payoff from defecting. But if everyone does that, then we're over here on the left side of the graph and everyone's getting very low reward. So it's very hard for, a vanilla RL agent to kind of learn this trade-off. Like, if you cooperate with me, I'll cooperate with you, and we'll be over here on this beautiful right side of the graph. They always want to greedily defect and pull everyone down to this left side of the graph. And yet what we see is that when we add this influence reward, the agents obtain higher collective payoff, which is actually evidence that they're learning to solve these cooperation problems. And they're actually doing so more effectively than previous work where it had special access to other agents' rewards, which we don't assume here. So but we said this isn't necessarily the case, that maximizing influence had to lead to cooperation. So why did it in this case? So what you're seeing here in this video is only this purple agent here has been trained with the influence reward. And you can see that it behaves a little bit differently than the other agents. So when there's no food, the other agents continue moving around and searching for food, but the purple agent actually stays still. And in fact, it only ever moves when there is an apple nearby. So it stays still, moves only if there's an apple. How does that allow it to gain influence over other agents? Well, what we're seeing here is a moment of high influence between that purple agent and this yellow agent. Because the environment is partially observable, the yellow agent can only see what's in this red box. So this here is its field of view. It can't see that there's this delicious green apple just outside of its field of view. But when the purple agent moves, which it only ever does when there's an apple nearby, that reliably signals to the yellow agent that there's food available and causes the yellow agent to change its intended plan, which gains influence for the influencer agent. Similarly here, this pink agent has been cleaning the river, but can't see if any apples have appeared as a result of its efforts. When the influencer agent stays still, that reliably signals that there are no apples, changing this agent's intended plan, and again, allowing the influencer to gain influence. So essentially what we've observed is that the influencer, in order to maximize influence over the other agents, learn to communicate valuable information about the presence of food to the other agents in order to gain influence. So it's a little close to that limited communication between bees that Jennifer was mentioning. So we thought this was really exciting. And we said, okay, the next thing we should do is, can we train agents to communicate with each other explicitly using this influence reward? So instead of having the agents just learn how to act in the environment, that's this red policy here, we're going to have them learn how to decide which of a set of discrete communication symbols to emit and show to every other agent at the next time step. And we're going to train them to send those symbols. They're going to get this influence reward based on whether their communication message caused the other agent to take a different action in the environment. And this is actually the second thing we do to address the problem that influence shouldn't necessarily be beneficial. We actually think that influence on the communication channel should provide beneficial information to the listener. And the reason is because the listener is actually free to ignore the messages that are being sent on the channel. And the listener, their actions are just greedily trying to maximize the number of apples they picked up. That's all they're doing with their apple policy. So the only reason the listener would update as a result of a communication message it received is if that message contained valuable information about how to optimize its own reward. So our hypothesis is that influential communication should provide valuable information to the listener. And what we see is that when we add this influential communication incentive, we do see higher collective payoff, so evidence that the agents are coordinating or cooperating more effectively. We also see that the communication protocols that emerge tend to be more meaningful. The speakers talk more about what they tend to be doing in the environment. There's more mutual information. But I think the really interesting result is this one. So what you're seeing here is the degree of influence between an influencer agent on the y-axis and an influenced agent on the x-axis. So for example, in this figure on the right, agent 0 is very easily influenced by all of the other agents. And what we see is that agent 0 also got higher environment reward. But this isn't actually a coincidence. This is true across hundreds of different hyperparameter settings in both environments. The agents that are more easily influenced, or better listeners, if you will, tend to get higher individual reward. So we think of this as evidence to support that hypothesis that influential communication is sending valuable information to the listener. So you can gain influence by sending useful information. So I want to raise a couple discussion points, which we can talk more about at the end as well. Whether the action influence leads to cooperation is going to depend on the environment. So we already knew that this doesn't necessarily have to lead to cooperation. We think one of the reasons that communication emerged in our setting is that the agents were still greedily motivated to pick up apples. So they can't spend all their time chasing other agents and getting in their way. Learning to share information may have been one of the cheapest ways to gain influence without deviating too much from their own apple picking policy. We also think that influence on self-interested agents via cheap talk communication should benefit the listener, but there's a caveat here as well. So this depends on the agents interacting repeatedly. If there was some way for me to communicate with an agent that I would never see again, I could potentially lie to gain influence. But if I'm going to see that agent over and over, it will learn to ignore me. So I would lose influence in the long term. So that's not the optimal strategy when the agents are interacting repeatedly. All right, so in conclusion, you can think of social influence as a unified method for promoting both coordination and communication in multi-agent settings. And it enables agents to learn socially but train independently. So it's a fully decentralized method, and unlike prior work, it doesn't require shared access to the other agent's parameters or rewards. So I can pause here for a quick question if anyone has one, but I did want to talk about one other piece of work.
Actually, Natasha, I have a super quick question for you on this, which is, were the agents in the scenario keeping track of each other as individuals? So when you're saying
Yes.
yeah, they were. Okay, so they have face recognition.
Exactly. Well, they know each other's ID.
Okay,
So
very good.
when they're hearing each other's messages, I'm hearing, the symbol number 3, I would know that it came from agent 0.
Got it.
So I do have a sense of which agent is which. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's how you can learn someone is a reliable speaker or not, and learn to ignore someone if they lie to you, basically.
Right. It's really interesting with insects. So bees do not recognize each other as individuals. They only recognize roles, but wasps do recognize each other as individuals. I've always wondered about why that is, but anyway,
That's
your work actually just suggests a theory about that. Anyway.
That's cool. All right. If there's no other questions, I'll go on to the last part. So I'm excited about this, and this is more recent work. This is specifically studying the question of social learning in multi-agent systems. And I think Jennifer said a lot of this, so I'll just quickly buzz by this. But the reason I think social learning is quite exciting is it can work in a more naturalistic setting. So basically, there's a lot of AI problems where you're in an environment with other agents. Like, let's imagine you're an autonomous car, but those other agents are not motivated to teach you. So they're not providing you very careful demonstrations of exactly what to do. They're just driving to work. They're just going about their own business. And the other issue is that, they may or may not have relevant expertise that you should be learning from. Like, not every car on the road is a good driver. So you shouldn't be indiscriminately copying the actions of every other agent, right? Which is often what we do in AI, actually. A very popular approach in AI is called imitation learning, which is just exactly copying a data set of expert trajectories. That's probably a bad idea in many real world settings. So this idea of social learning, as Jennifer explained, is you can be more sophisticated. You can learn which is the right model to learn from and in what contexts. So you learn how to acquire information from other agents. And I actually think this can help you adapt to new environments more effectively. If you know how to acquire information from experts, if something unexpected happens on the road, you can figure out how to learn what to do by observing the other drivers. And this is a key problem in AI. AI is very bad at adapting to new environments or generalizing. So I think it's very promising. So in this work, my student and I, Kamal, wanted to study how much do vanilla RL agents actually engage in social learning? And the way we chose to ask this question was to say, let's put RL agents in a multi-agent environment where there's an expert that's constantly demonstrating highly rewarding behavior. So the expert is just going to over and over and over again do a behavior that the learner should be doing. So that would lead to high payoff if you could just see what the expert is doing and copy that. And we measured the degree of social learning by looking at the difference between those social agents placed in the environment with the experts in purple and agents that trained alone from the beginning, so solitary agents. And what we found is that there's no difference between the RL agents placed in the environment with this expert constantly demonstrating what to do, which you would think of as a very valuable source of information and clue as to what you should be doing. But they're just not benefiting from that expert whatsoever. They're performing as poorly as agents that are trained alone. So they're not engaging in social learning. And in this work, we just took a very simple approach to try to address this issue. And what we did is we asked the agents to just predict their own next observation from their current state. So we added this auxiliary loss. And what that forced the agents to do is, in order to predict your next observation, you actually have to predict the action of the expert, because the expert is in your observation. So to correctly do that, you have to know where the expert is going to move. And just that was enough for the agents to encode enough information about what the experts were doing, that they were able to reach close to the performance of the experts that they learned from, and the same performance as imitation learning, which was given direct access to the actions of the expert and was able to copy them. So this is kind of cool. And you can say, oh, I can sort of passively learn from other agents in my environment. That's fun. But it's maybe a lot harder than just doing this imitation learning. So why would I want to do this social learning approach rather than imitation learning? Well, I think this is the exciting result here. So what we're looking at here is how well these social learners versus imitation learners generalize to a new set of environments that they've never seen during training. And what you see, as predicted, we see that the RL experts that the agents originally learned from in orange generalize poorly to the new environments. The imitation learners are even worse, but our social learners are actually generalizing pretty well to the new environments. And the reason they're able to do that is in the new environments, they can find the new experts that are experts at the new task and use their social learning skills to figure out how to adapt to the task by learning from the new experts. So this is kind of interesting. But this was a pretty simple approach for getting social learning to work. So can we do something a little more sophisticated in terms of getting better methods for social learning? So this is another project with a student, Angelos, and it's going to be based on successor features. So successor features are taking this quantity we care about in RL, our Q value, how many rewards we're going to get from starting in a certain state and taking a certain action. And they're breaking it down into two components. So this psi is going to do all the heavy lifting of predicting what's going to happen in the future. So it's going to accumulate a bunch of features at every state and predict all the things that are going to happen in the future. The W is just going to be our preferences over what we want to happen in the future. And the benefit of separating these things out is that we can easily adapt our policy to a new set of preferences. So let's say during training, I can pick up, I'm in a task where I can wander around and pick up apples, bananas, or pineapples. I don't know. My psi would count over the course of the episode, how many apples, bananas, and pineapples do I normally pick up? And then my W would just say, oh, you prefer to pick up apples. Well, at test time, I can instantly adapt to picking up bananas by just modifying that W and then computing how many bananas I'd be likely to pick up under the new W. So I can adapt really rapidly to new changes of preferences. So why is this cool for multi-agent? Well, we had the idea that this would actually be very useful for learning to selectively imitate from other agents. So now let's say we're in this autonomous driving scenario. We're the ego agent, and there's a bunch of other agents on the road. And we're going to try to learn to model both our own policy of the ego agent with RL and the policy of other agents using successor features, using the successor representation. And we can model the other agents with maximum entropy inverse RL. So basically by observing what actions they're taking, we try to fit this equation so we can learn that psi and W for every other agent. But why do we want to use successor features? Well, it allows for this rapid swapping out of preferences. So what we can do is we can say, hey, I've modeled every other agent, but I don't care about their preferences. I only care about my own preferences. So if I replace all of their preference vectors with my own, that actually allows me to compute the payoff that I would expect to get if I acted like agent 2, but according to my own preferences. So at every time step, I can basically say, I've been watching what every other agent is doing. I'm trying to pick up apples. Would acting like agent 2 or agent 1 be a more effective way to pick up apples than what I was going to do before? So I can kind of select, it's this selective imitation where we selectively imitate from appropriate models when we compute it would actually pay off for ourselves. And to get this to work, I should mention that we learn a shared feature representation phi that explains all agents' behavior. So that makes every agent's psi compatible with our W. And what's nice about this, if every agent's psi, including our own, is built out of the same phi, then we basically get a lot of signal about what features we should be extracting from the environment, what are meaningful features to extract. So you can think about this phi as basically this basis for behavior that is able to explain every other agent's behavior. And so I think Jennifer mentioned enhancement as like a basic form of social learning where other agents give you a clue about what to pay attention to in the environment. So you can think of this as a rudimentary form of enhancement, because in order to model agent 2, I have to model something about bananas. Well, then bananas are going into my feature representation. So that's kind of fun. The other thing is, as I'm interacting with the environment myself as the ego agent, I actually get to observe rewards, and I can use that to actually refine my phi even farther. So zooming out from the math to give you the bigger picture, basically, if you successfully model others, then you can use this technique to selectively imitate from them. When you compute, it would lead to higher reward for yourself. And then that can allow you to take better actions. And as you act more in the environment, you get more experience, which helps you refine that feature representation, which improves your modeling of others. So the better you model others, the better actions you can take. And the more actions you can take, the better you model others. To this nice feedback loop. So we tested this in a series of environments, including these driving environments. What we see is pretty fun. In the case where every other agent in the environment is doing exactly what you should be doing, the best thing you can do is just imitate everyone. And that's going to learn the fastest. But our method is pretty competitive. In the case where every other agent is doing the exact wrong thing, like they're just parking on the highway, then imitating them is catastrophically bad. So you should really not be doing that. But our method performs about as well as RL, so it's able to learn on its own when it has to. But in the more realistic case where every other agent, there's a bunch of other agents, some of them are doing relevant things, some of them are doing irrelevant things. Our method, which I should say is called sci-fi learning, which is fun, I haven't mentioned that yet, actually outperforms both RL and imitation learning. All right. We also get side benefits. We can accurately predict the actions of other agents. We can infer their reward functions and optimize them. And we can actually do better generalization. So if at test time, I've never been asked to pick up a pineapple, but I've observed some other agent doing it, I can adapt in one shot to doing that task by just updating my W and then being able to learn from the M agent I've modeled previously. In contrast, an imitation learning method would take 100 episodes to adapt to that new task. So we're getting a little closer to this type of generalization. So in conclusion, I think social learning is a very powerful learning mechanism that could help RL agents coordinate with other agents, adapt to new environments, and learn complex behavior. All right, so I'm happy to stop there and we can have more of a discussion.
Great. Thanks, Natasha. That was really interesting. I have a couple of questions, but I'm not going to interject yet. What I wanted to say was that it's really, your talk is a really fascinating juxtaposition to some of Jennifer's remarks. And I know the three of us have had a lot of great conversations in preparing for this session. I'm sure we could talk all day about this, but I wanted to sort of start off the conversation by first inviting our audience to participate in the conversation now. Please put your questions in chat or raise your hands. And if I miss a hand raising, please somebody else let me know, but you can turn on your microphone and ask, or I can ask for you. But I wanted to just start with a very sort of broad question, and it's actually a question for Jennifer, which is that in the context of AI, social learning is interesting to study, both as a way to build better AI, as Natasha has demonstrated, AI whose learning and thinking is computationally effective and that creates a learning environment that's conducive to human-machine interaction. But it also provides a sandbox for exploring theories of natural social learning that may be difficult to otherwise explore. And I think you've alluded to that both in your presentation and in some of your remarks afterwards. So Jennifer, I'm wondering, was there anything that particularly struck you from Natasha's presentation from the perspective of natural social learning? Do you see limitations or perhaps future opportunities to current approaches to social learning in AI?
I mean, I think there's so much going on in this body of work and in the research that Natasha was highlighting right now. That's extremely interesting. I mean, one thing that really jumps out with the sci-fi learning, I love that name. It didn't occur to me when I just saw the Greek characters. I had to hear you say it to get it. So one thing that occurs to me is that if social learning is about the acquisition of another agent's knowledge, there isn't a straight line between what agents know and what they do. That's always mediated by what it is they want, what it is that they're pursuing. And it's really interesting to me that that you're, incentivizing this sort of separation of modeling epistemic and motivational states, basically, in the other agents that that you're interacting with. And it's sort of like, no matter what you want, knowing more about your environment is almost invariably going to put you in a better position to attain it. And so if you're in an environment with a bunch of variegated agents who want different things, presupposing in some way that they're all somehow behaving intelligently is something that can, give you a huge advantage if you've got that capacity to sort of separate out what is this agent pursuing and what is it that that they know about reality. So it's really interesting to me to sort of think of that dynamic, and it seems like you get much more from an environment where you're interacting with agents who want different things. You get much more from their behavior in terms of future generalization than you would if you're in some kind of environment where all agents have just exactly the same agenda. And this really makes you think, okay, this could be part of the key difference in social learning between us and other animals, right? That, meerkats, they all basically want the same thing. They're all like grubbing after the same little invertebrates in the sand. And so interesting when you interact with other human beings, we're pursuing a variety of different goals, and some things we've got in common. But maybe that's part of how it is that we can learn so much from each other, that we're, attacking different problems, but we have this sort of common anchoring in knowledge of the world that's supporting all of our different endeavors. I'm just kind of curious, like really generally, like, do you have some thoughts on differences between, having really homogeneous agents and having variegated agents? Like, what kinds of differences does that make to social learning generally? Natasha?
Yeah, I mean, my guess would be you do actually want some variety, right? The ideal case would be, let's say each agent is pursuing some different sub-skill that's actually quite valuable, and you are able to successfully model all of those, then you could presumably cobble them together into achieving a more sophisticated goal than any of the other agents was pursuing independently, right? Whereas if every agent is doing the exact same thing, then there's not much benefit to modeling one additional agent.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Like, it seems that there's a sort of, possibility of a richer ecosystem that's going to be ultimately more instructive. I was also going to ask you, like, to what extent are you thinking of like genetic or ordinary genetic endowments in nature when you start trying to figure out, okay, what kinds of intrinsic motivations am I going to build into these agents? Like, when you had that idea to have them, okay, let's have them modeling other agents. Was that in any sense inspired by thinking about what humans are like or other animals are like, that we do seem to have, even as newborns, this sort of inductive bias, or this tendency to focus on other agents, right? Even newborns are oriented towards, the face, and in particular the eyes. That seems to be sort of built into our hardware as agents. Do those kinds of considerations guide you a bit when you're thinking of creating these artificial agents that are going to have the capacity for social learning?
Definitely. I think some of my work is very much inspired by, human social learning. So I have a paper on what if multiple agents had a joint attention incentive, right? Because joint attention is so important to human social learning, or like infant social learning. So I've tried that out. But I think more the median or the mode of my research is more like a key ability you might want is selective imitation. So how do you actually implement that? And it's true that humans definitely have selective imitation, but then that's more of a loose inspiration of how you come up with the algorithm itself. Right.
So Natasha, I'm curious, obviously, as human beings, at least, go beyond selective imitation when they are watching and learning from other social agents. And of course, when you're on the road driving, you aren't just watching to learn from the good drivers. You're also learning the behavior of the bad drivers so that you can avoid them and predict what they're going to do. Because and in some ways, that's a form of modeling your environment, but it is attributed to a particular agent. I'm wondering. Whether and you can't do it all, but I'm wondering whether you've thought about the value of that in the context of expanding the type of work that you're doing right now, or whether that's not on your particular trajectory.
Yeah, so something that has been on my radar is it valuable to make it, when you're modeling the world, is it valuable to make a distinction between modeling anything else in the world and another agent? Right. Should you be treating that differently? And then what type of model should you be applying? And so maybe is there something we could take from, thinking about like, what is an agent? Can we operationalize the definition of agency in a way that actually allows our RL agent to accurately detect things in its environment that have agency and then get a benefit from modeling them differently? So I think the like Dan Dennett version of agency is literally just, I get a benefit in terms of being able to predict what this thing should do by treating it as an agent rather than treating it as an inanimate object. So could you like take that definition and actually code that up and test it?
Yeah, and seemingly, I mean, you want to attribute goals and beliefs and desires and intentions to those agents, and there seems to be some utility in doing that, whether the agent is worthy of imitation or quite the opposite. Something that gives you value of predicting the future state of your environment. I had one other question that relates to Jennifer's question about which I found so compelling, about incentivizing agents to sort of accumulate knowledge. Is it the case that the agents are accumulating knowledge in general, or is it just the knowledge that is purposeful to achieving their particular goals? So I don't necessarily want to know what color socks Jennifer is wearing, unless those are predictive of where I'm going to eat dinner tonight, or whether I'm going to get that green apple. So is this acquisition of knowledge purposeful for the agent that is seeking out that knowledge, or is it just?
Yeah, in the sci-fi work, we actually assume that if any other agent is paying attention to it, you have to encode that as well. So we're kind of learning this universal feature representation such that if it's relevant to any agent, then we are now modeling it. So if you care about your socks, and or the color, if Jennifer cares about whether her socks are green and that's relevant to her reward, then I would have to model that as well. So that's the assumption we make in that work. And maybe there's a lot of room to improve there, because maybe that truly isn't relevant to me. But that I think would take a lot more sophisticated social learning to be able to make those distinctions to what I can throw away from other people's behavior and what I should be paying attention to. Yeah,
interesting. I see we have a question from Jillian Hadfield, and Jillian, I don't know whether you prefer that I read it, or whether you'd like to read it. You'd like to turn on your mic. Perhaps I'll start reading the question, and Natasha, you can see it as well. And yeah, there we go. So I'm wondering, so this is from Jillian Hadfield. I'm wondering about the normative component of social learning and how it plays out in Jennifer and Natasha's approaches. I mean, here, the fact that we have third-party enforced norms about how we engage in tasks. We collect apples like this, not that, and we'll make fun or criticize you if you do differently. This makes me think of Natasha's modeling of others. We can extend this to modeling others' judgment about ego's way of performing a task. So if that's a question for Natasha or Jennifer, and you can read it in the chat if I didn't do justice to it, or you want to review it again.
I think these normative questions are sort of terrifically subtle. So one of the sort of very sophisticated things we do at some point is model agents as those creatures that are also modeling us back, right? That agents aren't just sort of the creatures that are difficult to predict, because inanimate phenomena, the motion of leaves in the wind might be difficult to predict, but agents are really distinctive because they're sentient, because they can, among other things, tell what we're doing. That seems to be a really, really sophisticated application of cognition, though, and not something that that is shared by any species who are capable of any form of social learning. I'm also kind of intrigued by the thought that scholars like Mark Ho and colleagues have been putting forward that perhaps some of what goes on in the enforcement of norms is kind of different in kind from a lot of what we see in reinforcement learning. That in ordinary reinforcement learning, you are just suffering rewards and penalties from the environment that reinforce or extinguish certain kinds of behavior. Somehow with social feedback from other people, evaluative feedback, when people praise you, when they blame you, this doesn't have the same kind of impact on your behavior as ordinary environmental reward. And really specifically, it seems to do something very strange. It seems to actually make a difference in our reward functions, in what it is that we are pursuing as agents. So it's really interesting. Like, I think these norms and praise and blame, that's something that's unique to our species. That's something that seems to be related to this really sophisticated capacity to tell that another agent is modeling you. And it seems to be something that has some kind of impact on sort of the deepest thing in our architecture as an agent, which is like, what am I even pursuing, right? Other animals, like, the meerkats and the songbirds, they're just kind of like stuck doing whatever it is they originally find rewarding. And we seem to be in this very strange space of being able to take correction from others in our social network about what's rewarding, about what we should pursue. So my gut feeling would be that's a sort of extremely special and exotic function that we have, that we can kind of follow these norms. But I'd be really curious to hear what Natasha has to say, because I know there is some RL work that sort of explores the emergence of norms.
Yeah, that's, well, I just want to say that the point you just made is super interesting. So I just read this, Jan LeCun put out like a 50-page opinion piece on what is the path to human-like intelligence and what are all the components. And one of the things he argues is that we would have a set of intrinsic motivations, intrinsic rewards that are immutable by the agent. Like, it just pursues these and then does better and better ways of pursuing them and approximating them. But what you're actually saying is social motivations run so deep that they could actually change those intrinsic motivations as a result of feedback from other agents or judgments from other agents. I think that's super interesting. It'd be nice to think about.
Yeah, I imagine that there's some that we're absolutely stuck with, like we're stuck with certain needs,
hunger,
hydration, and so on.
Yeah.
We've got those sort of basic homeostatic drives. But then I think the sort of, more fine-grained stuff that we pursue, which is often quite different from what other people are pursuing, seems to get sculpted in a way that's very special in our species.
Yeah, that's super interesting.
It's interesting to think about whether it changes your reward or whether it just changes your behavior, because your reward is already just about complying with these social norms. It may just change your behavior. It's a secondary, or a meta.
Yeah, but we also struggle to change social norms too, which can make it somewhat more complicated. I like Jillian's follow-up, and I maybe
agree hardly. Read it, Jennifer.
Okay. The plasticity of goals is what makes us so extraordinarily more cooperative and
right.
productive than other species, right? That we can shape what other people are pursuing.
So I see we also have a question. Maggie has her hand raised. Maggie, do you want to speak, or that would be great if you feel comfortable and are able to do so.
I can speak. I'm
Great.
just going to caveat. I'm a little bit new to this whole sphere. I really don't have a background in machine learning.
No
but
problem.
Natasha, there's one thing that I'm really, really curious about. I have more of a background in sort of sociology and law, and so the thing I'm really curious about when I see anything that talks about multi-agent or like social learning in these machine learning models is, you talk about sci-fi and how you can teach an agent, okay, they're foraging for bananas, and we can now, with sci-fi, we can switch that out and say, okay, now you're looking for apples, and they have that learning and they bring it with them. I'm wondering if when they leave that environment, like, is there that same human aspect where I've learned something and it's stuck here, and so now even if I have a secondary goal, like, is there is there that? And if not, like, is it a possibility that we can train an agent in a certain environment and then, say, okay, when I deploy you into the world, your main goal might be whatever the company wants it to be, but we've also trained you not to like break these main laws that we really want you to have learned in that environment.
Right. Okay. So there's a couple different things there. So I think one of the biggest drawbacks or like issues that we're struggling with AI right now and why we don't have autonomous household robots in your house is actually this issue of generalization. So basically AI that trains in one environment is actually quite bad at applying those skills to a new and seemingly very similar environment. So that's actually a big issue. And I think maybe social learning is one of the ways that could help you adapt to that new environment. And then I think the second part of your point is, let's say I'm trying to adapt to that new environment. I'm interacting with a person in their house. Maybe I've been deployed to their house. I probably want to infer what they should be wanting me to do to help me adapt. So if I'm a robot that's helping you load your dishwasher, I should infer what preferences you have over how to load your dishwasher. But then there's also this issue of safety constraints. Like, how do I not break your dishes? And how do I ensure I'm actually in line with what you want me to do? I don't, break all your dishes so I never have to load the dishwasher again or do something that isn't the real reward function. So for that, I would actually, if you're curious, recommend some of Stuart Russell's work. So he's got this book that's pretty fun. It's called Human Compatible. And a lot of the students in his group have worked on these alignment questions. How do you actually stay safe? How do you stay aligned to the human's preferences? So Dylan Hadfield-Manel is great, had some great work on that. So yeah.
So we have one last question in the chat by Steve Coyne, who I'm going to invite to speak if he'd like to. Sure. And then I wanted to ask you one final question as a sort of closing question of our session. Okay, take it away, Steve.
Okay, so my question is just, do you think there's any relationship between learning from others on the one hand and the second order attitudes you might have towards your own epistemic policies? So in particular, like one relationship might be like, if in order to learn from others, whether you're an artificial agent, a meerkat, a human being, or whatever, do you actually need to be in a position to evaluate your own epistemic policy? Or is it just enough to be able to carry it out?
I think it kind of depends what you mean by epistemic policy, right? Like, you certainly have to be able to learn from the environment, but I don't think you need any sort of self-reflectiveness to learn from other agents. That would be my stab at that.
Yeah, I would guess this is real. I wanted to ask you guys a question about mimicking versus really understanding, and I suspect that relates to what Steve's getting at as well. It's a fascinating question, and of course, for those who've been following it, relates a little bit to some of the discussion about Lambda that we were talking about last week. One of the large language models that an employee had thought, a Google employee had thought was sentient in some way. But the last question I wanted to ask you both was whether there's a dark side to all of this, and we often as AI researchers are compelled to reflect not only on all that can be gained and all the benefits from our research, but also on perhaps some of the threats that they present. And I was wondering whether each one or the other of you or both of you could comment a little bit on that. So social learning seems so powerful.
Just very briefly, it is very powerful, and there's such enormous data sets that can be learned from, which have so much social knowledge encoded in them. So these large language models have access to, a huge amount of our cognitive infrastructure as a species. And I think we've got to be very, very, very aware and very alert of potential for harm with the deployment of these materials, especially because the more that AI researchers know about social learning, the more they can push our buttons socially, and craft communications which will be persuasive to us or which will manipulate us. I have to say, I was at some point during Natasha's presentation thinking, yeah, I do worry about creating agents that get reward for making us do things, right? For being causally influential on us. I mean, I know they're in this grid world. You've got them nicely sequestered there. They're not gonna get out and get in our faces. But I think on the other side, the more that we research these mechanisms, the better positioned we are at the same time to sort of protect ourselves against their abuses. But I'd be curious what Natasha thinks of this.
Yeah, I think in trying to influence or manipulate humans is a really scary thing that we should not be pursuing. Perhaps being able to assess how much influence one agent has on another is still valuable if you want to actually detect that kind of adversarial behavior. Like if there are persuasive bots on the internet trying to detect how much they're actually influencing the people they're talking to could be useful. But in terms of also just, you mentioned like large language models and large scale copying of that kind of language data, I think one of the biggest things I'm scared about is just picking up on our biases, like our cultural biases, racism, sexism. It's very much the case that these models do pick up on these types of bias and exhibit those types of bias. So we should maybe exercise caution before deploying them into every single product. Yeah, there are definite risks.
Yeah, thank you both for your reflections, and as I'm being reminded by my colleagues at SRI, I'm afraid the clock is telling us that this session has to draw to a close. But it's always good to leave the audience wanting more. I'd like to once again thank both of you, my two speakers, Natasha Jakes and Jennifer Nagel, for this incredibly engaging and interesting conversation and for sharing your expertise with us. On behalf of Gillian Hadfield, the director of Schwartz Reisman Institute for Technology and Society, I'd also like to thank the audience and all of today's speakers for what's been an incredibly stimulating day of conversation, and to invite you back tomorrow for more of the same. We have another great lineup tomorrow. Wednesday starts off at 11:45 with an opening talk by Anna Sue, followed by Collective Agency and Evolution in AI with Kate Larson and Richard Watson, which is moderated by Dennis Walsh. And then we'll wrap up the day tomorrow with a discussion of building democratic social choice into recommender systems with Taylor Owen and Jonathan Stray, and that's going to be moderated by Peter Lowen. So I hope you'll come back tomorrow, and I invite everybody in the audience to please give a round of applause to our two wonderful speakers. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sheila. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And goodbye, everyone.